The Wyoming wind screamed across the canyon, like the dying breath of ancient gods, carrying with it the metallic taste of approaching doom and the promise of a blizzard that would entomb the living beneath frozen graves. Comanche pressed his weathered palm against the ice-slicked rock face for balance each labored step, sending molten agony through the old bullet wound in his left thigh, a memento from Sergeant Mackenzie's Springfield rifle during the skirmish at Willow Creek 3 winters past, when he tried to protect a small Cheyenne camp from what the soldiers called a preventive strike, but what any honest man would call cold-blooded murder. The storm had raged for 4 relentless days, transforming familiar hunting paths into white-shrouded death traps that could devour a man's bones without leaving a trace. During the worst of it, huddled in a shallow cave, with nothing but jerky and melted snow to sustain him, Comanche had dreamed again of Sarah, Singing Wind, and their children. Not the nightmares of death and flames that usually haunted his sleep, but memories of perfect happiness that felt more cruel than any torture. He remembered the morning when little Wolf, barely 5 years old, had awakened before dawn to help his father check the rabbit snares. The boy had been so excited to play hunter that he'd put his shirt on backward and his moccasins on the wrong feet, yet insisted he was ready for the trail. Sarah had laughed so hard watching him swagger around their lodge that she'd awakened baby Morning Star, who joined the laughter with delighted gurgling sounds. They'd spent that entire perfect day together, father teaching son to read tracks in the soft earth beside the river, mother weaving while humming the old songs Baby Morning Star, taking her first wobbling steps between the lodge poles. It had been one of those crystalline moments when a man realizes he possesses everything that matters in the world. That camp had been destroyed 6 months later. Sarah and the children buried beneath cottonwoods that still whispered their names when the wind moved through dying leaves. And Comanche had been transformed from a man with everything to live for into something far more dangerous, a warrior with nothing left to lose except his own worthless life. Now, as he struggled down the treacherous slope with hypothermia clawing at his resolve, the old guilt gnawed at him with familiar teeth. He'd been away that terrible morning, tracking an elk bull through the high meadows when the cavalry had come calling with their civilized brutality. By the time he'd returned following smoke columns visible from 5 miles away, his world had been reduced to ash and silence. The other survivors had looked at him with eyes that held accusation sharper than spoken words. Where was the great warrior when his family needed protection? Through the swirling curtain of snow ahead, something dark jutted from a drift, beside a grove of wind-twisted pines. A raven cawed once from above its black wings, stark against the white sky, before it wheeled away toward the valley below, as if even death's own messenger found this scene too grim to witness. Comanche's heart thundered against his ribs as he recognized the pale curve of a small hand. Fingers curled like a dying blossom, reaching toward a sun that would never again grant warmth. He collapsed to his knees in the deep snow, his damaged leg shrieking protest, and frantically clawed away the white burial shroud with hands that trembled from more than bitter cold. Each handful of snow he cast aside revealed more of the small form beneath a child, perhaps 8 winters old, wearing a thin cotton dress completely inadequate for these killing temperatures. Her lips had turned the color of twilight shadows, and ice crystals adorned eyelashes that might never flutter open again unless he acted with desperate speed. The face that emerged belonged to a girl whose mixed heritage was written clearly in her features. High cheekbones that spoke of native blood, but skin that had never quite darkened to full bronze hair, that caught reddish highlights in the pale mountain light. Her twisted left leg was immediately apparent bent at an unnatural angle that spoke of birth trauma or childhood injury never properly healed. But beneath his quivering fingertips, he detected the faintest whisper of breath so fragile it might have been wishful thinking born of a warrior's desperate hope. Without conscious decision, Comanche stripped away his heavy buffalo coat, feeling the instant bite of wind against his wool shirt, and pressed her against his chest. The terrifying coolness of her flesh seemed to draw warmth from his body like a vampire. But he held her close, wrapping the coat around them both while scanning the frozen landscape for shelter. As he lifted her, she stirred slightly, and for just a moment her head tilted to one side, in a gesture so familiar it stopped his breath cold the exact same way his cousin Joseph used to cock his head when listening for deer sign in the forest, the same unconscious movement little Wolf had inherited and displayed whenever concentrating on some new skill. In the distance, something moved between the trees. Not the familiar bulk of elk or deer, but the lean, predatory shapes of wolves, drawn by the scent of weakness and approaching death. Their eyes reflected the pale light like golden coins, and their patient stalking spoke of creatures who understood that winter and exhaustion were their most reliable allies. A pack of 5, maybe 6 following at careful distance, but closing the gap with each stumbling step he took. Time had become his deadliest enemy, and salvation lay 12 treacherous miles through snow that could claim them both before the sun climbed above the mountain's teeth. But as Komanche began the grueling descent toward McCready's trading post, carrying this dying child whose every gesture reminded him of lost family, something stirred in the deepest chambers of his memory, a recognition that went beyond conscious thought, a connection that whispered of purposes larger than mere chance. The next 4 hours tested every reserve of strength and skill that 43 brutal winters on this merciless frontier had burned into his bones. The trail down Eagle Ridge was treacherous under the best conditions, but with fresh snow concealing loose rocks and hidden ice patches, every step became a calculated gamble with death. His wounded thigh sent lightning bolts of agony through his entire left side, with each jarring impact the old bullet wound grinding like shattered glass embedded in living muscle. Yet he pressed onward with grim determination. The child stirred occasionally in his arms, muttering words in fevered delirium that sounded almost like fragments of the old tongue words that made his heart race with impossible recognition. Once, when they paused to rest in the shelter of a massive boulder, she opened her eyes with brief clarity and looked directly at him. "I know you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind's howling. "Mama used to tell me stories about a warrior with kind eyes who would come when hope was gone." Before he could respond, she had slipped back into unconsciousness, leaving him to wonder if the words had been real or merely fever-induced hallucination born of his own desperate wishes. The wolves grew bolder as afternoon shadows lengthened the lead female, venturing within 30 yards of their struggling path. Komanche could see her clearly now, a massive gray bitch with intelligent amber eyes and scars across her muzzle that spoke of many successful hunts. She was testing his resolve, probing for signs of weakness, waiting for the moment when exhaustion would make him vulnerable. When she took another step closer, he managed to draw his Winchester one-handed and sent a .44-40 round, cracking through the mountain air just above her head. The shot echoed off canyon walls like thunder, and the pack melted back into the tree line. But their golden eyes continued to track his progress with patient hunger. By the time full darkness threatened to claim the mountains, Komanche could see smoke rising from McCready's chimney in the valley below, a beacon of civilization and warmth that seemed impossibly distant. The final descent nearly proved his undoing, as a section of trail had been washed away by autumn rains, leaving only loose scree and ice-glazed rock faces that offered treacherous handholds. Twice, he nearly fell, once sliding 15 feet down a steep slope before managing to arrest his descent against a stubborn pine tree that left his ribs aching and his grip on the child precarious. But somehow, through sheer force of will and the kind of stubborn endurance that had kept him alive through 3 years of meaningless existence, he stumbled through the heavy oak doors of McCready's trading post, just as the last light faded from the western peaks. His legs were quaking from exhaustion, his breath forming phantom clouds in the Arctic air, and ice crystals clung to his dark hair like diamonds. But the child in his arms still drew those shallow, precious breaths that meant life continued its tenuous hold. Hot water and blankets quickly. Comanche gasped, his voice raw from hours of battling the wind's fury. Clean cloth whiskey for medicine, whatever you possess, that might coax life back into her body. Angus MacReady, the Scottish proprietor whose calloused hands had witnessed every variety of frontier catastrophe in 15 years of trading with trappers, miners, and desperate souls, assessed the situation with one experienced glance and began bellowing orders to his wife, Moira, in a mixture of English and Gaelic that conveyed both urgency and authority. Within moments, they had positioned the child near the blazing stone hearth, working with the practiced efficiency of people who had pulled other souls back from death's threshold. Moira, a woman whose maternal instincts had been sharpened by raising 4 children on this unforgiving frontier, stripped away the frozen garments with gentle hands, while her husband stoked the fire to roaring intensity. The child's skin displayed the mottled blue-white discoloration of severe frostbite, particularly on her extremities, and her pulse fluttered beneath MacReady's experienced fingers like a wounded sparrow fighting for flight. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," whispered Tom Brennan, the ranch hand, who'd been nursing coffee by the fire when they'd burst through the door. He was a weathered man in his 50s, whose Irish accent had never quite faded despite 2 decades in Wyoming, and his pale blue eyes widened with dawning recognition as he studied the child's distinctive features. "That's little Susanna Palmer, certain as I'm drawing breath. What in the name of all that's holy happened to the poor little thing?" Comanche lifted his gaze sharply from where he knelt beside the makeshift bed they'd arranged near the hearth, his dark eyes reflecting firelight like polished obsidian. "You know her, people." "Aye, that I do." Brennan's voice carried the weight of uncomfortable knowledge, the tone of a man who had witnessed things that troubled his sleep. Palmer's wagon took a spill up by Devil's Creek 4 days past, right when the storm was reaching its worst fury. Word came down through the valley that they lost some supplies and busted a wheel, but everyone made it through safe and sound. He paused, avoiding direct eye contact, while his work-hardened hands worried the brim of his felt hat. Leastways, that's the story Palmer told Sheriff Morrison when he rode into town 2 evenings back, looking relieved as a man who'd just had a great burden lifted from his shoulders. The ice forming in Comanche's gut had nothing to do with the morning's bitter cold, and everything to do with the terrible implications taking shape in his mind. "What truths are you withholding, Brennan?" Moira MacReady glanced up from where she was attempting to coax warm broth between the child's blue lips, her maternal instincts clearly troubled by the direction of the conversation. "Tom, if you possess knowledge that might aid this little one, this isn't the time for discretion." Brennan shifted uncomfortably, his weathered features reflecting the moral struggle of a basically decent man, who had learned that sometimes speaking truth could be more dangerous than remaining silent. There was loose talk at Murphy's saloon night before last. The kind of talk men make when they've consumed too much whiskey and believe nobody's paying attention to their words, or maybe when their consciences are gnawing at them something fierce. What manner of talk? Comanche demanded, though dread was already sketching the picture in stark, terrible detail. Palmer was in there celebrating something, buying rounds for the house, and talking loud about how the storm had been like divine providence solving one of his biggest problems without him having to make any hard decisions. Brennan's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, as if speaking the words too loudly might make them more real. He was drunk enough to be careless with his tongue, bragging about how sometimes nature takes care of burdens that Christian charity won't let a man handle properly. Moira's hands stilled in their gentle ministrations, and her face paled with understanding. "Dear God in heaven, you're saying I'm saying the girl's been cursed with that twisted leg since birth." Brennan continued, reluctantly gesturing toward Susanna's obviously deformed limb. "Makes her slower than molasses when they're traveling, especially through rough country where every step could mean life or death." "And Palmer?" "Well, he's been struggling something fierce to keep his ranch from going under. Lost most of his cattle to wolves, and harsh weather last winter fallen behind on his mortgage payments to the bank in Cheyenne. Every mouth to feed represents a burden he can barely shoulder, and when that mouth belongs to someone who can't contribute much to the family's survival, the truth struck Komanche like a physical assault connecting with memories of his own children, and the lengths a parent would go to protect them. Or in this case, the depths to which a man might sink when twisted by desperation and selfishness. He abandoned her with deliberate intent. That's what some folks are whispering when they think nobody's listening. Brennan confirmed, his voice heavy with the shame of bearing such knowledge. Called her dead weight at Murphy's, said she was consuming food they couldn't spare for someone who couldn't earn her keep through useful work. Word is, he told his wife the storm would handle their problem permanent-like, and they'd be free to start fresh somewhere else with just the children who could contribute to the family's survival. As warmth began to penetrate Susanna's frozen body and restore circulation to her extremities, she stirred with increasing frequency, her eyelids fluttering like butterfly wings, testing the air. When consciousness finally returned in tentative stages, she looked around the unfamiliar surroundings with the wariness of a wild creature suddenly aware of potential predators, her dark eyes taking in the stone fireplace, the rough-hewn walls, the concerned faces of strangers. But when her gaze found Comanche's weathered features, something remarkable happened. Her expression shifted from fear to recognition, as if she were seeing someone from a half-remembered dream made suddenly real. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind, moaning outside the thick log walls. You are safe." Komanche replied gently, his tone carrying the same inflection he'd once used to comfort his own children after nightmares. "My name is Komanche. I found you in the snow and brought you to shelter where kind people could help you heal. I remember now." She tried to sit up but lacked the strength, her small body still fighting the effects of severe hypothermia. "Papa was so angry when I couldn't keep up with the wagon. The snow was so deep and my leg hurt something terrible and I kept falling behind." Her voice cracked with remembered pain that went far deeper than physical discomfort. "He said I was slowing everyone down, eating too much food for someone worthless. He said I wasn't his real daughter anyway, just a mistake from Mama's past that needed correcting before it dragged the whole family down." The adults exchanged glances filled with horror and rage. But Susanna wasn't finished with her revelation. In her exhaustion and gratitude, perhaps feeling safer than she had in years, she began to hum a melody so hauntingly familiar that Comanche's breath caught in his throat like a fish hook finding soft flesh. It was a lullaby his aunt used to sing to the children of their band, one passed down through generations of Cheyenne mothers to their babies during the quiet hours before dawn. The melody was perfect, every note exactly as he remembered from his own childhood, every subtle trill and pause precisely as his grandmother had taught his aunt, who had taught his mother, who had sung it to him, in the days when the world was young and full of possibilities. But this was impossible. This was a song known only to his family, line a melody that had never been shared outside their immediate clan because it was considered sacred. A gift from the spirits that was meant to protect children from the dark things that moved in the space between sleep and waking. How could this pale child with her mixed blood and twisted leg know music that belonged to his people, his family, his most treasured memories? "Where does this Palmer make his home now?" Komanche asked Brennan, his voice tight with new urgency that went beyond simple concern for an abandoned child. "His ranch sits about 14 miles north of here up in Willow Creek Valley, where the hunting's still decent and the grazing can support what's left of his herd." Brennan's expression grew troubled as he recognized the dangerous intensity in the warrior's eyes. "But Komanche, you need to understand something important. Palmer's got allies in this territory. Influential allies who see him as a solid, God-fearing settler trying to carve something decent from this wilderness. Sheriff Morrison counts him as a friend, and the banker Morrison's brother-in-law extends him credit based on their personal relationship." McCready nodded grimly. "Tom's speaking truth. Palmer may be a bastard behind closed doors, but he's got a talent for presenting himself as a respectable family man when it serves his purposes. And if he's already told people the child died in the storm, then my word against his becomes the testimony of a savage against a Christian gentleman. Comanche finished bitterly. The same story that's been told across this territory since the first white man decided Indian lives were worth less than cattle. But as he looked down at Susanna, watching her small fingers trace patterns in the air, while she hummed that impossible sacred melody, Comanche knew with absolute certainty that there was more to this situation than a simple case of child abandonment. The way she moved her hands and the tilt of her head, when concentrating the unconscious gesture she made, when thinking every detail spoke of connections that ran deeper than coincidence, of blood ties that transcended the boundaries of race and circumstance. I have to confront him, Comanche said finally, whatever the consequences. The trek to Palmer's homestead the following morning tested every reserve of strength and determination that Comanche possessed, pushing his damaged body to limits that would have broken lesser men. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, creating drifts that reached above his knees in places and concealed treacherous sinkholes where careless travelers could shatter bones or disappear entirely beneath deceptive surfaces. His wounded thigh, which had already endured far more stress than was wise during the previous day's rescue mission, now sent constant waves of agony through his entire left side with each labored step. The old bullet wound felt like a red-hot poker grinding against the bone, and by mid-morning, he was leaving traces of blood in his footprints, where the injury had reopened beneath the constant strain. 3 hours into the journey, when the sun had climbed high enough to create the illusion of warmth while the temperature remained well below freezing, Comanche became aware that he was no longer traveling alone. The wolf pack had found his scent trail during the night, following the blood scent like a dinner invitation written in crimson across the pristine snow. At first, they were merely shadows moving parallel to his path through the dense pine forest, gray phantoms that matched his labored pace, while maintaining careful distance, testing his awareness and resolve, with the patience of predators who understood that time and exhaustion were their most reliable weapons. But as the morning progressed and his movements became increasingly unsteady, they grew bolder. The lead female, the same scarred bitch who had tested him the previous day, was the first to venture within 50 yards of his struggling path. She was magnificent in her deadly purpose. Easily 100 pounds of muscle and intelligence wrapped in a winter-thick fur, her amber eyes holding the calm assessment of a killer who had survived too many hunts to count. When she took another calculated step closer, obviously sensing his weakness, Comanche stopped and drew his Winchester with deliberate slowness, making sure the metallic sound of the action cycling carried clearly through the still mountain air. He didn't fire immediately. Ammunition was precious, and he needed these creatures to understand that he remained dangerous despite his obvious vulnerability. "I know your game," he said aloud, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "You're thinking this old warrior is wounded and tired, easy prey for patient hunters. But I've been dancing with death since before you were born, sister. I've got enough fight left to take at least 2 of you with me, and your pack can't afford those losses this close to the hardest part of winter." The female cocked her head, studying him with unsettling intelligence, then sat back on her haunches in a gesture that seemed almost conversational. For a long moment, man and wolf regarded each other with mutual respect, 2 apex predators who understood the harsh mathematics of survival, each recognizing competence in the other despite their natural enmity. Finally, she rose and melted back into the forest, her pack following like smoke dispersing in wind. But Comanche knew they hadn't abandoned their interest entirely. They would continue to parallel his journey, waiting for any sign that his strength was failing beyond recovery. By the time the pale sun reached its highest point behind a veil of gray storm clouds, Comanche could see smoke rising from Palmer's chimney in the valley below. On the thin column marking human habitation in this vast wilderness like a flag of dubious civilization. The homestead appeared like something carved from desperation, and maintained through grim stubbornness a cluster of rough-hewn log buildings with a sagging roof patched with tin scraps and canvas corrals that spoke of better days before hard times had winnowed away most of the livestock and the general air of a place where dreams had come to die slow, bitter deaths. The final descent nearly proved his undoing as ice had formed on the rocky slope overnight, creating surfaces as treacherous as polished marble and twice as unforgiving. Twice he slipped and slid several yards before managing to arrest his fall against protruding stones or stubborn scrub brush, each impact jarring his wounded leg until stars danced before his eyes and nausea rose in his throat like bitter medicine. But somehow, through the kind of stubborn endurance that had carried him through 3 years of meaningless existence since his family's death, he made it to level ground and approached the weathered front door of the Palmer homestead with firm, deliberate steps that belied the agony coursing through his damaged body. Komanche knocked with controlled authority, not the desperate hammering of a man seeking help, but the measured announcement of someone who had every right to be there and would not be easily dismissed. Heavy footsteps answered from within, accompanied by the unmistakable metallic click of a shotgun's hammers being drawn back to full cock, a sound that spoke of paranoia and guilt in equal measure. The door opened exactly 6 inches, revealing a man's suspicious face, framed by the gap between door and jamb. Thomas Palmer stood slightly below average height, but carried himself with the aggressive posture of someone who had learned to compensate for physical limitations through sheer meanness and carefully cultivated cruelty. His face bore the permanent scowl of a man who viewed the entire world as a personal insult, and his small dark eyes held all the warmth of winter stones. "What do you want here, you filthy Indian?" Palmer's voice carried the casual contempt of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, backed by the implied threat of the weapon he held ready just inside the doorway. "I carry your daughter," Komanche said, adjusting his position slightly to display the small bundle he'd fashioned from his spare shirt and a section of rope. The bundle was empty, of course. Susanna remained safe at McCready's trading post, but Palmer couldn't know that from his limited vantage point. Found her nearly frozen to death in the snow up near Eagle Ridge. She requires medical attention immediately, and as her father, you bear responsibility for providing it. Palmer's gaze flicked to the bundle with an expression that revealed more than he intended, not relief or gratitude or even surprise, but annoyance, and barely contained rage, the look of a man whose carefully laid plans had been disrupted by unwelcome complications. "But that ain't my daughter, you damn red devil." Palmer snarled, his voice rising with manufactured outrage that couldn't quite conceal the underlying fear. "I don't know what game you're playing, but you've got the wrong family." The people at McCready's trading post identified her specifically as Susanna Palmer. Komanche replied evenly, his tone carrying quiet authority. "She's perhaps 8 years old with a twisted left leg and features that speak of mixed heritage. She knows your name, knows details about your family that only someone living in your household could possess. I don't give a rat's ass what those meddling fools told you." Palmer's voice cracked slightly, the strain of maintaining his lie beginning to show. "That little bastard isn't my blood, and she's not my responsibility anymore. She's the worthless result of my whore wife's wandering affections with some traveling half-breed trader who came through these parts years ago." From somewhere behind Palmer, deeper in the house, a woman's voice called out with desperate weakness. "Thomas, please, she's just a child. Whatever happened between us doesn't change that she needs help." "Shut your goddamn mouth, Martha." Palmer roared, spinning partway around to address the unseen speaker with vicious fury. "You created this problem when you spread your legs for that red-skinned bastard, and now you want me to spend my family's food and warmth keeping his spawn alive. I've got legitimate children to think about, children who carry my blood and deserve my protection." Komanche felt ice forming in his veins that had nothing to do with the mounting cold. "Whatever sins you believe were committed in the past, she remains a child who will die without proper care. No sins of her parents justify condemning an innocent to death by exposure. Then that's the Almighty's will working itself out naturally. Palmer replied with chilling indifference that spoke of a man who had already made peace with his choice. The weak don't survive out here, and she's been nothing but dead weight since the day she drew her first breath. Twisted leg slow mind consuming precious food that should go to children who can actually contribute something useful to this family's survival. Martha Palmer appeared in the doorway behind her husband like a ghost materializing from shadow. A thin woman with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had witnessed far too much cruelty over too many years. Her face bore the yellowish remnants of old bruises, and her movements carried the careful precision of someone accustomed to avoiding sudden violence through constant vigilance. When she opened her mouth to speak again, perhaps to plead for basic human decency, Palmer's left hand lashed out in a vicious backhand that caught her across the mouth with sickening force. She staggered backward, blood streaming from her split lip, but her eyes never left Comanche's face with an expression that begged him to understand what she couldn't say aloud. "You've got 5 seconds to start walking before I put you down like the mangy dog you are." Palmer said, his finger moving to the shotgun's trigger with practiced ease. "This is my property. That bastard child isn't my responsibility, and I'll shoot any trespassing savage who tries to tell me different." With no other choice available and certain that Palmer would indeed follow through on his threat, Comanche turned and began walking away from the homestead, each step sending fresh agony through his wounded leg. Behind him, Palmer's voice followed like a curse delivered from the mouth of hell itself. "And don't come back with any more lies about finding children in the snow. Next time I won't waste ammunition on a warning." The shotgun blast shattered the afternoon silence like thunder splitting stone buckshot, whistling past Comanche's head close enough to sever several strands of his dark hair and pepper the snow ahead of him with lead pellets. He stumbled toward the tree line as quickly as his damaged leg would allow, knowing Palmer was already breaking open the weapon to reload with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had threatened violence too many times to count. A second blast echoed across the valley as Komanche reached the relative safety of the pine trees, the sound waves rolling off the surrounding peaks like the laughter of malevolent spirits. But he was already moving deeper into the forest, using thick trunks for cover as he navigated toward a narrow ravine that would provide concealment for his retreat. The 3-mile journey back toward McCready's trading post became a nightmare of endurance that tested every survival skill Comanche had learned during 4 decades of frontier existence. His wounded leg pushed far beyond its limits during the confrontation, with Palmer began to buckle with increasing frequency, forcing him to use a broken pine branch as a makeshift crutch that left his hands raw and bleeding from the rough bark. Worse, the wolf pack had returned with reinforcements, their numbers swollen to perhaps 10 individuals who moved through the forest with coordinated precision that spoke of experienced pack hunters working together toward a common goal. They no longer maintained careful distance, emboldened by the scent of fresh blood and the obvious weakness of their prey. They had closed to within 20 yards and were testing his resolve with increasingly bold approaches. The largest male, a black-furred giant with yellow eyes and scars across his muzzle that testified to countless battles, actually stepped directly into the trail ahead of Comanche and stood his ground with the calm confidence of an apex predator who had decided the time for patience had passed. Comanche stopped and met the creature's gaze directly, his hand moving slowly toward the knife at his belt, since drawing the rifle would require movements too sudden and threatening for the delicate balance of this moment. "You think you have me, brother," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "You see an old warrior struggling with an old wound, leaving blood sign that draws you like summer draws lightning. But you're forgetting something important. I didn't survive this long by being easy prey, and I've got enough iron left in my spine to make killing me cost more than your pack can afford." The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds, man and wolf, taking each other's measure with the calculating intensity of beings who understood that the next few moments would determine who lived and who died. Finally, perhaps recognizing something in Comanche's eyes that spoke of desperate competence rather than helpless weakness, the great male stepped aside and melted back into the forest, with his pack following like shadows, dispersing at dawn. But Komanche knew this was merely a temporary reprieve. The wolves would continue to track him, growing bolder as exhaustion weakened his defenses, waiting for the moment when injury and blood loss would make him vulnerable to coordinated attack. By the time he stumbled back through the doors of McCready's trading post, the sun was already setting behind the western peaks in a display of crimson and gold that painted the entire valley in shades of fire. His face was gray with exhaustion and blood loss. His movements had deteriorated to barely controlled stumbling, and the crude crutch had worn grooves in his palms that leaked red onto the trading post's plank floor. Susanna, now conscious and wrapped in warm blankets near the stone hearth, took one look at his condition and struggled to sit up, despite Moira McCready's gentle restraining hands. "What did he do to you?" she asked, her young voice carrying fierce protectiveness that seemed incongruous coming from someone so small and damaged. "Your father made his position clear," Komanche replied, accepting the cup of hot coffee that Angus McCready pressed into his shaking hands. "He claims no responsibility for your welfare and threatened violence if I return to his property. He's not my real papa anyway," Susanna said with quiet dignity that spoke of hard-won wisdom. "Mama told me the truth when she thought I was sleeping. My real father was a trader who came through here years ago, a good man who would have loved me if he'd known I existed." Tom Brennan, who had remained at the trading post through the day, exchanged meaningful glances with the McCreadys before clearing his throat uncomfortably. "There's something else you folks need to know," he said reluctantly. "While Komanche was gone, I rode into town to check on some supplies. Palmer beat him there by 2 hours, and he's already been talking to Sheriff Morrison." The ice returned to Comanche's veins. "What story has he told?" "Claims you kidnapped his daughter from their wagon during the storm," Brennan replied grimly. "Says you threatened his family with violence and stole the child for purposes he didn't want to speculate about in polite company. Sheriff Morrison's organizing a posse to come after you, and Palmer's painting himself as a desperate father trying to rescue his beloved child from a savage who means her harm." Moira McCready's face flushed with righteous anger. "That's the most outrageous lie I've ever heard. The child was half dead from exposure when Komanche brought her here, and anyone with eyes can see she's been neglected and mistreated. Try convincing a jury of that when it's Palmer's word against an Indian's," McCready said darkly. "Especially when Palmer's got friends in high places and the territorial governor's been making speeches about the need to maintain order and protect decent settlers from savage depredations." Susanna looked around at the adults with growing understanding and fear. "They're going to take me back to him, aren't they? Even though he left me to die." Before anyone could formulate a response that might offer false comfort, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the thick log walls, many horses moving at the determined pace of men with official business and little patience for delays or explanations. Through the trading post's single window, they could see torches flickering in the gathering darkness as at least a dozen mounted men formed a rough perimeter around the building. Sheriff Morrison's voice cut through the night air with official authority. "Komanche Walking Bear, you're surrounded. Come out with the child hands visible, and no one needs to get hurt." Palmer's voice joined the chorus, cracking with theatrical anguish that would have been laughable if the situation weren't so deadly serious. "Please, Sheriff, that animal has my baby daughter. God only knows what he's done to her." Komanche looked down at Susanna, seeing his own grim understanding reflected in her dark eyes. She was old enough to comprehend the hopelessness of their situation, mature enough to recognize that adult lies often carried more weight than children's truth. "I won't let him take you back," Komanche said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapons. "There are too many of them. McCready warned. And if you resist, they'll use it as justification for whatever violence they're already planning. Susanna struggled to her feet, her twisted leg making the movement awkward, but her determination absolute. If I go with them willingly, will they leave you alone? No. Komanche replied with absolute certainty. Palmer's already told his lie. He needs me dead or discredited to maintain his story, and Morrison's already chosen which version of truth he's going to believe. The trading post door opened slowly, revealing Sheriff Morrison flanked by several armed men whose faces reflected the grim satisfaction of righteous purpose. Morrison was a man in his 40s, whose political ambitions had taught him the value of appearing decisive in situations that might enhance his reputation with influential voters. Step away from the child. Morrison commanded, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. You're under arrest for kidnapping and threatening the welfare of a minor. Sheriff Morrison. Moira McCready stepped forward with maternal fury blazing in her eyes. That child was dying of exposure when this man brought her here. Look at her condition. Does she appear to be the victim of kidnapping or the survivor of abandonment? Morrison's gaze flicked briefly to Susanna. Taking in her obvious weakness, the frostbite marks on her extremities, the clothing completely inadequate for winter survival. For just a moment, doubt flickered across his weathered features as the evidence before his eyes contradicted the story he'd been told. But Palmer was already pushing forward, tears streaming down his face in a performance worthy of professional theater. My poor baby. What has this animal done to you? Come to Papa, sweetheart, you're safe now. Susanna recoiled as if struck, pressing herself against Comanche's side with unmistakable terror. Don't let him take me, she whispered. Please, he locked me in the bedroom and started the fire because he wanted me to die. Mama Martha tried to stop him, but he hit her so hard she couldn't get up. The words hung in the air like accusations written in fire. But Palmer's response was swift and unpracticed. She's delirious with fever, he cried, reaching toward her with seemingly desperate affection. This red devil has filled her head with poison, threatened her, until she doesn't know truth from nightmare. She needs proper medical attention, not the barbaric remedies of a savage. Morrison's expression hardened as he made his decision based more on political calculation than evidence. I'm sorry, child, but fever can make people say things that aren't true. And you, he pointed at Komanche, you're under arrest for kidnapping and child endangerment. The iron shackles that closed around Comanche's wrists felt like the jaws of a steel trap, each link representing another nail in the coffin of justice. He watched in helpless anguish as Palmer gathered Susanna into his arms with theatrical tenderness, crooning reassurances, while she went rigid with terror that no adult seemed willing to acknowledge. As they prepared to load him onto a horse for the journey back to town, Komanche caught one last glimpse of Susanna's face over Palmer's shoulder. Her dark eyes met his across the space between truth and lies. And he saw her mouth silently form a single word in what might have been Cheyenne, hey, help me. But the word could have been English just as easily, help me. A child's desperate plea disappearing into the darkness as men who called themselves civilized rode away with their captured savage and his supposed victim, leaving justice buried beneath the same snow that had nearly claimed a little girl's life. The jail cell was a cage built from rust-streaked iron and mortar, mixed with the despair of forgotten souls, its bars casting prison-striped shadows across stone walls that wept moisture in the mountain cold. Sheriff Morrison had left Komanche shackled to a ring embedded deep in the wall, the iron cuffs biting into his wrists with every movement and cutting off circulation until his fingers began to tingle with numbness. Through the single barred window, positioned too high to offer any view, except a narrow slice of sky, he could track the passage of time by the changing quality of light. Gray dawn giving way to pale noon, then sliding inexorably toward the crimson sunset. that would mark another day stolen from Susanna's short life. The wound in his thigh had begun to fester during the long night infection setting in, as his body's reserves finally gave out after too many days of punishment and stress. Fever came and went, in waves, bringing with it dreams that blurred the boundaries between memory and hallucination, between the past he'd lost and the future he was helpless to protect. In his fevered delirium, he saw Sarah singing wind, standing beside the narrow cot that served as the cell's only furniture, her beautiful face unmarked by the flames that had claimed her life. She was braiding Morningstar's hair with the patient care he remembered so well, her fingers working the traditional patterns that marked their family lineage, while humming lullabies in the old tongue. "You found her," Sarah said without looking up from her work, her voice carrying the same gentle authority it had possessed in life. "Joseph's daughter carries our blood, sings our songs. She needs you the way Little Wolf once needed his father's protection. I failed them all," Komanche whispered, not caring if the guards outside might hear him talking to phantoms. "Failed you, failed our children, failed to protect what mattered most. How can I save her when I couldn't save my own family? Because this time, you know the truth," Morningstar said, looking up at him with eyes that held all the wisdom her 2 short years had never allowed her to accumulate. "This time, you won't be away hunting when the wolves come calling." The vision faded as consciousness returned, leaving him alone with iron shackles and growing desperation. But through the fever and despair, one truth burned with absolute clarity. Susanna was Joseph Standing Bear's daughter, his cousin's child family by blood and inheritance. The lullabies, she knew the gestures that reminded him so powerfully of lost relatives, the way she tilted her head when thinking all evidence of connections that transcended the boundaries of race and circumstance. Joseph had been more than a cousin. He'd been the brother Comanche had never had by birth, and the companion who had shared childhood adventures and adult responsibilities with equal dedication. They had hunted together, fought together, dreamed together of the families they would raise and the legacy they would leave for future generations. Joseph's death 3 years earlier had been another wound in Comanche's spirit, another loss in the cascade of grief that had nearly destroyed his will to live. But now, Joseph's daughter, his daughter, needed the protection that Komanche had failed to provide his own children. The symmetry was too perfect to be coincidence, the connections too meaningful to ignore. Fate had brought them together in that snowdrift, giving him one last chance to fulfill the sacred duty of family protection that he'd failed so catastrophically before. Near midnight, when the wind outside had died to a whisper, and the guards had settled into their routine drowse, Komanche noticed something that made his heart race with desperate hope. The glow on the northern horizon was wrong, not the pale reflection of moon on snow, but the angry orange of flames consuming wood and hope with equal hunger. The Palmer Ranch was burning, and even at this distance of several miles, he could hear the roar of destruction carried on the night wind. Somewhere in that inferno, Susanna might be trapped, abandoned once again by the man who called himself her father, while denying any real responsibility for her welfare. "You help fire at the Palmer Ranch," Komanche shouted, yanking against his shackles with strength born of desperation. "Someone needs to ride out there. There are children in that house." But his voice disappeared into the wind without acknowledgement, and the guards remained slumped over their card game in the outer office, too drunk on whiskey and self-importance to investigate the ravings of their savage prisoner. Komanche pulled against the iron chain, connecting his shackles to the wall, feeling the metal links bite deeper into already raw wounds as blood began to flow more freely. The pain was enormous, but it paled beside the agony of knowing that Susanna might be dying while he remained helpless to reach her. In the corner of the cell, he found a sharp-edged stone that had broken away from the mortared wall during some previous prisoner's desperate escape attempt. The rock was roughly the size of his fist, with one edge honed to razor sharpness by constant grinding against the stone floor. Grasping it with bloody fingers that shook from fever and exhaustion, he began hammering away at the weakest link in his chain, the connection point, where the shackles joined the ring embedded in the wall. Each impact sent shockwaves through his arms and jarred his wounded leg until stars danced before his eyes, but he continued with methodical desperation. The rock chipped and cracked under the constant abuse, cutting his palms to ribbons with each blow, but gradually the metal began to show stress fractures that spoke of eventual failure. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness, while the glow on the northern horizon grew brighter and more terrible, each brightening flame representing another moment stolen from whatever time Susanna might have left. Sweat poured down Comanche's face, despite the bitter cold seeping through the stone walls. But still he hammered away with mechanical persistence. The chain finally parted with a sound like gunshot and the sudden release, sending him sprawling backward across the narrow cell. But he was already scrambling to his feet, adrenaline temporarily overriding the fever and exhaustion that had been wearing him down for hours. The cell window was barely wide enough for a desperate man, its iron bars spaced just far enough apart to allow passage for someone willing to sacrifice skin and dignity for freedom. Komanche forced his way through the opening with the single-minded determination of a man who had nothing left to lose, scraping away layers of flesh on his shoulders and back before dropping 10 feet to the frozen ground behind the jail. Then he was running through the snow toward the burning ranch, his shackled hands swinging with each stride, the chain between his wrists catching moonlight, like silver serpents dancing in the darkness. His wounded leg screamed protest, with every step threatening to buckle and send him sprawling face first into the snow. But somehow, he maintained his footing and continued forward with grim determination. The heat from the burning ranch struck Komanche like a physical blow. When he was still 200 yards away, flames so intense they had melted snow in a wide circle around the buildings and turned the winter night into a preview of hell itself. The main house was fully engulfed roof beams, crashing down in showers of sparks that rose toward the stars like prayers written in fire and smoke. Through the thunderous roar of destruction, barely audible above the sound of his own labored breathing, he could hear a voice calling for help. High-pitched, desperate, unmistakably that of a terrified child trapped somewhere in the inferno. Susanna. Her name tore from his throat as he reached the perimeter of the fire, his voice cracking with desperate urgency. "Call out again. Where are you?" "You're here. In the back room. I can't move. Something's holding me down." The voice was definitely hers, coming from what appeared to be a rear bedroom, whose window was not yet completely blocked by flames. The front porch had collapsed entirely, blocking the main entrance with a tangle of burning timber and debris that would have challenged a healthy man with proper tools. But the window to the back bedroom remained partially accessible, though flames were already licking at the frame and smoke poured through the opening in thick, choking clouds. Without hesitation, Komanche grabbed a fence post from the nearby corral and used it to smash through what remained of the window glass, clearing away jagged shards with his shackled hands, while ignoring the cuts that added fresh blood to his already considerable collection of wounds. Then he hauled himself up and through the opening, disappearing into an interior that resembled nothing so much as the mouth of hell itself. The heat inside was beyond human endurance, so intense that each breath seared his lungs and sent his eyes streaming tears that evaporated almost before they could form. The wooden floor groaned ominously under his feet, some planks already charred through and glowing like coals, others sagging dangerously as support beams weakened and began to fail. Smoke filled every cubic inch of available space so thick that visibility was reduced to perhaps 3 feet in any direction. Each inhalation required an act of conscious will, and after the first few breaths, Komanche realized he would have perhaps 5 minutes of consciousness before smoke inhalation rendered him as helpless as the child he'd come to save. "Susanna, keep calling. I can't see you through this smoke." "Here, right here. I'm trapped under something heavy." Following her voice through the smoke-choked room, Komanche found her pinned beneath a massive roof beam that had fallen diagonally across her legs, the heavy timber slowly catching fire as flames from above crept closer with each passing second. The beam was easily 3 feet in circumference, and green pine heavy with sap, weighing several hundred pounds, and positioned at an angle that made leverage nearly impossible. "I'm going to lift this beam," he shouted over the roar of flames that were now consuming the ceiling above them. "When I do, you crawl toward that window as fast as you can move. Don't look back, don't hesitate, just get outside and keep going until you're clear of the fire." The timber was hot enough to raise blisters on exposed skin, its rough bark studded with splinters that tore at his hands as he sought purchase. Komanche planted his feet on either side of Susanna's trapped form and lifted with every ounce of strength his fever-weakened body could muster his wounded thigh, immediately protesting with lightning bolts of agony that threatened to buckle his knees. The beam rose 6 inches, then 8, just barely enough clearance for a small child to wiggle free if she moved quickly and didn't panic. But the effort required to maintain that lift was enormous. And Komanche could feel his damaged leg beginning to buckle under the strain as sharp pain shot through his entire body like liquid fire. "Now go now." Susanna squirmed out from under the crushing weight with desperate efficiency. But instead of immediately crawling toward the window, she turned back toward him with stubborn determination that reminded him painfully of his own children. "I won't leave you here to die," she said, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. "We go together then." He gasped, letting the beam crash back down as his strength finally gave out. "Stay low, the smoke is thinner near the floor." Together, they crawled toward the window, opening the floor beneath them, beginning to sag ominously as support beams throughout the house weakened beyond their capacity to bear weight. Behind them, the ceiling collapsed with a thunderous roar that sent a shower of sparks and burning debris cascading down where they had been standing moments before. Komanche boosted Susanna through the window, first her small form disappearing into the blessed coolness of the night air beyond. Then he hauled himself up and over the sill, scraping away more skin in his haste, but finally tumbling free just as the floor behind them gave way with a sound like the world ending. They collapsed together in the snow 30 feet from the burning house, gasping for clean air while their lungs tried to purge themselves of smoke and superheated gases. The contrast between the hellish interior they'd just escaped and the bitter mountain cold was so extreme that for several minutes neither could do anything except lie still and marvel at the simple miracle of being able to breathe. But their escape had been witnessed, and Thomas Palmer stepped out of the barn shadows with his shotgun raised, and the expression of cold satisfaction that was more terrifying than any rage could have been. "Well, I'll be damned." Palmer said, his voice carrying the calm matter-of-factness of a man discussing the weather. "Looks like my problem just tried to solve itself, but sometimes a man's got to finish what Providence started." Palmer appeared remarkably composed for someone whose house was burning down around his ears. Too composed, in fact, for someone who hadn't been expecting this exact scenario to unfold. His clothes weren't disheveled, his face wasn't streaked with soot or tears, and he carried himself with the satisfaction of a man whose plans had proceeded exactly as intended. "You're going to murder a child in cold blood." Komanche gasped, struggling to his feet, while keeping himself positioned between Palmer and Susanna. "I'm putting down a rabid animal and ending the suffering of a burden that never should have drawn breath in the first place," Palmer replied with chilling reasonableness. "Then I'll tell Sheriff Morrison and anyone else who asks how I tried my best to save you both, but arrived too late to prevent this tragic accident." Palmer raised the shotgun to his shoulder with practiced ease, both barrels pointing directly at them with the steady confidence of a man who had thought through every aspect of this moment and found it satisfactory. His finger moved toward the trigger, and Komanche knew with absolute certainty that they had perhaps seconds left to live. But in that crucial moment, Susanna did something completely unexpected, and she began to sing her young voice, carrying clearly through the night air, despite the roar of flames and the thundering of Comanche's heart. It was the Cheyenne lullaby again, and the sacred melody that belonged to their family line. And her voice was so pure and haunting that even Palmer hesitated for a moment, that proved crucial. Nesevone he na nehno. She sang the ancient words, carrying power that transcended mere sound. Sleep now, help is coming. That moment of hesitation, that fraction of a second when Palmer was distracted by the unexpected beauty of her voice, was all the opening Komanche needed. He lunged forward not directly at Palmer, but toward a pile of snow-covered firewood beside the barn, his shackled hands closing around a thick piece of split oak that had been seasoned to the hardness of iron. Palmer's finger tightened on the trigger, just as Komanche hurled the wood with all his remaining strength and desperation. The improvised projectile struck Palmer's shoulder with enough force to spin him halfway around, sending both barrels of the shotgun discharging harmlessly into the air with a sound like thunder rolling across the valley. Palmer staggered backward off balance and cursing, but managed to maintain his footing while reaching for the revolver at his hip. Komanche was on him instantly, the chain between his shackles becoming a weapon as he wrapped it around Palmer's throat and used his remaining strength to drag the smaller man to the ground. "You tried to kill her twice." Komanche snarled, tightening the chain with methodical pressure, while Palmer clawed desperately at the iron links, cutting off his air supply. First in the snow, then in the fire. A helpless child whose only crime was being born with blood you couldn't accept. Palmer's struggles grew increasingly frantic. As oxygen deprivation began to affect his consciousness, his face turning purple in the firelight, while his hands flailed uselessly at the chain that was slowly strangling him. But just as his movements began to weaken toward unconsciousness, Komanche made a decision that would have surprised his enemies. He loosened the chain and allowed Palmer to breathe. "I could kill you now," Komanche said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "Take your life as payment for what you tried to do to her. But that would make me the savage you've always claimed I am, and she doesn't need that burden on her conscience." Palmer collapsed unconscious in the snow alive, but defeated while behind them, the house completed its collapse with a final roar that sent sparks cascading toward the stars like defeated prayers. In the distance, Komanche could hear the thunder of approaching horses. Sheriff Morrison and his posse drawn by the fire's glow, and probably expecting to find only charred remains where truth had once lived. But this time, things would be different. This time there would be witnesses to hear the truth from the child's own lips, and Palmer's carefully constructed lies would crumble in the face of evidence that even the most prejudiced observers couldn't ignore. Sheriff Morrison arrived with what seemed like half the territory behind him, with their horses beating out a rhythm of official authority against the frozen earth as they formed a rough circle around the smoking ruins of the Palmer homestead. The sight that greeted them challenged every assumption Morrison had made about the situation. Palmer unconscious and apparently defeated in the snow. Komanche standing over him with the smoking remains of the house, providing dramatic backdrop, and Susanna alive, but obviously traumatized by experiences that went far beyond simple kidnapping. "Mother of God," Morrison breathed, dismounting slowly, while his hand remained near his holstered weapon. What in the name of all that's holy happened here? Before Komanche could formulate a response that might be believed by men whose minds were already poisoned with Palmer's lies, Martha Palmer stumbled forward from the barn, where she had apparently been taking shelter, her face streaked with tears and soot, her clothes disheveled in ways that spoke of genuine terror rather than theatrical performance. It was Thomas. She said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, despite its obvious weakness. He set that fire with his own hands, using lamp oil he'd been hoarding for weeks. Locked Susanna in the back bedroom and poured the oil around the door frame before he struck the match. A ripple of shock passed through the assembled men, several of whom had known Palmer for years and considered him a respectable member of their community. But Martha wasn't finished with her revelations. Years of silence enforced by violence had finally reached their breaking point, and truth poured from her like water bursting through a broken dam. "I won't be silent anymore." Her voice grew stronger with each word, fed by rage and guilt that had been festering for too long. He's been beating that child since she could walk, calling her names. No child should hear treating her like some kind of animal that didn't deserve basic human kindness. That's a goddamn lie. Palmer had regained consciousness and struggled to his feet, his voice hoarse from the near strangulation, but still carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being believed without question. She's hysterical, doesn't know what she's saying. That red devil threatened our whole family, probably forced her to say these things. But Martha had found her courage at last, and 20 years of accumulated abuse had finally reached the point where even fear couldn't silence her testimony. 4 nights ago, when that terrible storm hit and we were struggling through Devil's Creek, he deliberately left Susanna behind when she couldn't keep up. She continued, her voice gaining strength from the simple act of finally speaking truth after years of enforced silence. Told her to wait by that old lightning-struck pine while we went ahead to find better shelter. But he never intended to go back for her. Old McCready pushed forward through the crowd, his weathered face reflecting the moral outrage of a man who had seen too much frontier cruelty to maintain polite silence any longer. Sheriff Morrison, I was there when this warrior brought the child to my trading post. He said with the authority of someone whose word had never been questioned in 15 years of dealing with every variety of frontiersmen. She was half dead from exposure, and he damn near killed himself carrying her through the worst blizzard I've witnessed in 2 decades of Wyoming winters. More voices began to join the growing chorus of testimony townspeople who had witnessed Palmer's cruelty over the years, but had remained silent out of social pressure or simple cowardice, now finding their consciences awakened by the dramatic evidence spread before them. Tom Brennan stepped forward, hat in hand, his weathered features reflecting the shame of a decent man who had remained silent too long. I heard Palmer bragging at Murphy's saloon about how the storm had solved his biggest problem, he admitted reluctantly. Said sometimes nature takes care of burdens that Christian charity won't let a man handle properly. We all knew what he meant, but nobody wanted to get involved in another man's family business. Dr. Peterson, the settlement's only medical practitioner, knelt beside Susanna and began examining her condition with professional thoroughness. What he found painted a picture that contradicted every aspect of Palmer's story about loving parental concern. This child shows clear evidence of prolonged neglect and abuse. Peterson announced, his voice carrying the weight of medical authority that even Palmer's allies couldn't easily dismiss. Malnutrition, untreated injuries, frostbite, consistent with prolonged exposure to severe cold. These aren't the injuries of someone who was kidnapped from a loving home. They're the accumulated damage of systematic cruelty. The weight of evidence was becoming overwhelming. But it was Martha Palmer's final revelation that transformed the entire situation from tragedy into something approaching justice. She approached Susanna, slowly kneeling in the snow beside the child with tears streaming down her face, and spoke words that had been locked inside her heart for nearly 9 years. I need to tell everyone the truth about who you really are, sweetheart, she said gently. The truth I should have spoken years ago, when it might have saved you from so much pain. Martha stood slowly facing the assembled crowd, with the dignity of someone who had finally found the courage to speak truth regardless of consequences. Susanna isn't Thomas Palmer's biological daughter. She announced, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed gathering. She's the daughter of Joseph Standing Bear, a Cheyenne trader who came through these parts every spring for several years running. We had a relationship during one of Thomas's long trips to Denver, and Susanna was the result. The implications hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow, and Komanche felt understanding dawn like sunrise after the longest night of his life. Joseph Standing Bear had been more than just his cousin. He'd been the brother Komanche had never had by birth, the companion who had shared every important moment of his youth and early manhood. Joseph Standing Bear was my cousin, Komanche said quietly, his voice thick with emotion that transcended mere surprise. We grew up together, hunted together, fought side by side during the conflicts with the cavalry. He was killed 3 years ago in a skirmish near Fort Laramie. But before he died, word came back through the trading networks about his family connections. Martha nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face as years of carefully guarded secrets finally found their freedom. Joseph told me about his family before he left that final spring. She confirmed. About a cousin who bore scars from great losses, a warrior who had lost his own wife and children to the same kind of hatred that Joseph feared would someday claim his life. I think the spirits guided you to her in that snow-brought family together when she needed protection most. Susanna looked up at Komanche with new understanding dawning in her dark eyes as that he could now see clearly resembled those of his beloved cousin, carrying the same intelligent depth that had made Joseph such an effective trader and negotiator. "Does that mean we're really family?" she asked, her voice carrying the hope of someone who had never known what it meant to belong anywhere. "We were always family." Komanche replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Blood just makes it official, but love and choice make it real." Sheriff Morrison looked around at the faces surrounding him, witnesses whose testimony had transformed his simple kidnapping case into something far more complex and morally challenging. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony consistent, and the physical proof undeniable. Palmer's lies had crumbled in the face of truth, spoken by too many voices to ignore. "Not Thomas Palmer," Morrison said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of official authority backed by community consensus. "You're under arrest for child abandonment, attempted murder, arson, and making false accusations against an innocent man." The emergency town meeting was held 3 days later in the white-painted church that served as the community's largest gathering space. Word of the Palmer case had spread throughout the territory with the speed of wildfire, and people had traveled from settlements as far as Denver and Cheyenne to witness what many were calling an unprecedented legal and moral situation. The pews were packed with ranchers, shopkeepers, miners, their wives and children, creating a diverse cross-section of frontier society united by curiosity and the rare opportunity to witness justice being served rather than merely discussed. Reverend Williams, who had initially been skeptical of the charges against Palmer, had spent considerable time interviewing witnesses and examining evidence before reaching his own conclusions about truth and responsibility. Sheriff Morrison addressed the crowd from the simple wooden pulpit, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been forced to examine his own assumptions and found them wanting. "We're here to determine the custody and care of Susanna Standing Bear Palmer," he announced, using her full name for the first time in official proceedings. "Thomas Palmer has been formally charged with multiple felonies, including child abandonment, attempted murder, and arson. Martha Palmer has signed legal documents stating that her own fragile mental and physical condition makes it impossible for her to provide proper care for the child." The legal reality was stark and unprecedented in territorial history. Susanna was effectively an orphan with no known relatives willing or able to accept responsibility for a child of mixed heritage, who carried the additional burden of physical disability. Under normal circumstances, she would have been placed in an orphanage or apprenticed to some family willing to accept free labor in exchange for minimal care. But these were not normal circumstances, and the community that had gathered to determine her fate was being asked to consider possibilities that challenged every conventional assumption about race, family, and social responsibility. McCready rose from his pew near the front, his Scottish accent lending additional gravity to words that carried the weight of 15 years' experience with frontier character. "I've known Comanche Walking Bear since he first started trading in these parts," he testified. "He's a man of honor who risked his own life to save a child that wasn't his responsibility, then risked it again to rescue her from a fire set by the man who should have been protecting her." One by one, other voices joined the growing chorus of support. Dr. Peterson testified to Comanche's gentle care during Susanna's recovery from exposure, describing medical attention that rivaled anything he could have provided himself. Reverend Williams spoke of redemption and the power of love to heal wounds that law and logic couldn't touch. Tom Brennan stood up slowly, hat in his weathered hands, and addressed the assembly with the dignity of a working man who had found his conscience. "I kept silent when I should have spoken," he admitted. Heard Palmer bragging about getting rid of his burden, saw evidence of his cruelty, but told myself it wasn't my business to interfere. This warrior showed more Christian charity in one night than the rest of us managed in years of looking the other way. But it was Martha Palmer's final testimony that provided the emotional crescendo the gathering needed to transform abstract legal proceedings into human drama with clear moral dimensions. She stood slowly in the back pew, her voice carrying across the hushed church like a prayer finally answered after years of desperate silence. "Joseph Standing Bear was a good man," she said simply. "Kind, gentle, intelligent, everything I had hoped to find in a husband, but never discovered in the man I actually married. He loved me as completely as I loved him, and if circumstances had been different, Susanna would have grown up knowing her father's affection instead of suffering Thomas's resentment." She paused, gathering strength for the revelation that would complete her testimony. "Before Joseph left that final spring, he told me about his family connections, about a cousin who was also a trader and warrior, someone who had suffered great losses but maintained his honor despite overwhelming grief. He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I would find a way to contact this cousin and tell him about the daughter he would never get to meet." Martha reached into her coat and withdrew a small object wrapped in faded cloth, a beaded medallion in traditional Cheyenne patterns that seemed to glow with its own inner light in the church's afternoon illumination. "Joseph made this for his future children before he left that final spring," she continued, her voice breaking with emotion. "He said it carried the protection of his ancestors and would ensure that his blood would never be completely lost to the world." Komanche stared at the medallion with wonder and recognition, immediately identifying the intricate beadwork as his aunt's handiwork from decades past. It was a piece of his family's history created by hands he had loved and lost, returned to him through pathways too meaningful for mere coincidence. The vote was overwhelming in its decisiveness. By a margin of 87-3, the community voted to grant legal custody of Susanna Standing Bear Palmer to her blood relative Comanche Walking Bear, with the understanding that he would be provided with a homestead claim, basic financial support, and whatever assistance needed to raise her properly within the bounds of civilized society. As the meeting dispersed into the evening air, Martha Palmer approached them one final time, her movements carrying the careful dignity of someone who had finally found peace after years of conflict and compromise. "I know I can never make up for what I allowed to happen," she said quietly. "The years of silence, the cruelty I witnessed without stopping the fear that kept me from protecting an innocent child who deserved better than either of us gave her." She pressed the beaded medallion into Comanche's hands, her own fingers trembling with emotion and exhaustion. "But I want you to know that Joseph was everything good I ever found in this hard world," she continued. "He would be proud beyond measure to see his daughter with someone who loves her as completely as you obviously do someone who risked everything to give her the protection and family she's never known." Outside the church, snow had begun falling again, not the killing blizzard that had brought them together, but the gentle snow of early spring that promised renewal and the possibility of second chances. Comanche lifted Susanna onto their horse, then swung up behind her, the medallion safely tucked in his coat pocket, where it would remain close to his heart. "Are we really going home now?" Susanna asked, leaning back against his chest, with the trust of someone who had finally found safety after a lifetime of fear and uncertainty. "Yes," Comanche replied, his voice carrying conviction that reached deeper than mere words. "We're going home to start the life your father would have wanted for you, surrounded by the love and protection that should have been yours from the beginning." As they rode through the falling snow toward the small cabin the community had provided as their new beginning, Komanche began telling her the first story in the language of their people. The ancient tale of how family can be found in the most unexpected places, and how love can survive even the harshest winters that life and circumstance can devise. Ahane, Ahane. He began using the traditional opening that meant long ago in Cheyenne, his voice carrying the cadence and authority of generations of storytellers who had kept their people's history alive through oral tradition. There was a warrior who lost his family to the flames of hatred. He continued, and a little girl whose father's heart had turned to ice with selfishness and fear. But the Great Spirit had a plan that neither could see, a design that would bring them together when hope seemed lost and love appeared impossible. Susanna listened with rapt attention as her cousin's voice carried the ancient words through the falling snow, finally learning the stories that connected her to a heritage she'd never known she possessed. The lights of the settlement grew smaller behind them as they made their way home, bound together by ties stronger than mere blood choice, courage, and love that could weather any storm the frontier might bring. For the first time in 3 years, Komanche felt complete. He had failed to save his first family, but he had gained a new one through pathways that spoke of divine purpose rather than mere chance. The scars would always remain visible, reminders of loss and failure, but they no longer defined his existence. Instead, they had become part of a larger story that included redemption, hope, and the possibility that even the deepest wounds could heal when love provided the medicine. The frontier remained harsh and unforgiving. Winter winds would continue to test their resolve, and prejudice would challenge their right to exist as family. But they would meet these challenges together, a Cheyenne warrior and his cousin's daughter, bound by blood and choice by courage and love, that had survived every test fate could devise, ready to write their own story of survival and belonging. In a world that had tried to tear them apart, but had only succeeded in making them stronger. Behind them, the burned ruins of the Palmer homestead disappeared into darkness, taking with them the ashes of cruelty and lies. Ahead lay possibilities as endless as the Wyoming sky adventures yet to be shared, and the simple miracle of family restored when all hope had seemed lost. The medallion pressed against Comanche's chest seemed to pulse with warmth, as if Joseph's spirit rode with them through the snow, finally at peace, knowing his daughter had found the love and protection he had always wanted to provide.